panel. So as I said, the first panel will be talking about the subject of essentially global, the panel's title is called Common Values in the New World Order, Geopolitics, Multilateralism, and the Future of Democracy. And we have four very distinguished people to join us on the panel. So let me start to welcome them. The first is Professor Andrew Sheng, Chief Advisor to the China Banking Regulatory Commission, and the former head of the Monetary Authority, the Securities Commission in Hong Kong. Second, Dr. Eric Lee, founding and managing director of Chengwei Capital, who's a well-known public commentator, writes extensively worldwide. And if you haven't read his articles, please go and read them. Third, Professor Kurokawa Sensei from Japan, who's a professor emeritus of the National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies and was a lead investigator for the Fukushima disaster and one of the most respected public intellectuals in Japan. And last but not least, Professor Sor Hoon Tan, Professor of Philosophy, Singapore Management University. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for being with us. I think you can all see we've gone to a lot of efforts to make sure we have a representation which is from the region but truly global. Professor Andrew Sheng has lived in the United States, worked for the World Bank, etc., and truly brings an international perspective. Everyone here on the panel has done things in different parts of the world, and so they don't bring just very simple national views. So the format is going to be as such. I'm going to invite each panelist to take 3 or 4, maximum 5, please, minutes to make their opening statements. Again, please feel free to share whatever is on your mind. We want a bold and open conversation. And once everyone's made their opening contributions, we will then have a discussion, which I will try and moderate intelligently. And once we've done that, we will have about 15 minutes for Q&A, and then finally some summing up. So if that's okay with the panelists, I'm going to ask Professor Andrew Sheng to make his opening remarks. Over to you, Professor Sheng.
Thank you very much, Chandran. It's a terrific honor to join this panel and to listen to Daniel Bell, whom I admire a lot on his writings. I think the topic that we are discussing this morning is really boils down to a question: how do we survive in a single planet with nearly 8 billion people with diverse culture, history, institutions, languages, and values? So can we find the common values at all? That's a really, a central question to that area. Now, everybody thinks that, the situation today is normal. It is, in historical terms, very unusual. The unipolar multilateralism was only introduced after the Second World War, when the United States supplanted the British Empire as the unipolar moment. The United States accounted for half of world GDP. The rest of the world was in shambles. America provided the Marshall Plan, opened up to globalization, established the unilateral institutions that was very beneficial for the world. And I think the rest of the world actually lived with that. But before the unipolar multilateralism, it was multipolar multilateralism. It was many powers, no one single power contender, dominated everybody, and everybody had their voice. So when the success of the unipolar multilateralism and globalization was a victim of its own success, because as other people, other countries rose, especially the emerging markets, China, Russia, Brazil, India, etc., Japan, Germany, European Union, etc., Africa, everybody wanted their own voice. And then suddenly, somewhere, around about 10 years ago, the unipolar started saying, wait a minute, I'm not going to provide more public goods. I'm going to sanction people who do not agree with me. I am even going to contain them. Now, that raises a fundamental, a question. What are the common values that would bind us? The problem is there is a feeling, groups are always identified through identity. People who share the same language, same culture, same values. But are these values absolute or are they relative? And the reality, of course, is that all values are relative. A human being is not a human being unless he lives within a society. And therefore, it is very important to understand that different people, Christian, Muslims, Hindu, Confucian, African, have very different values. And because there are very different values, how do you live with these different values? So the answer is that there is no absolute value. There are commonalities, but the borderline between one value and another is not very clear. It is actually infused within each other. So the only common value is that we have to live with each other, even though we do not agree or we do not like each other. And so the real common value is to recognize each other, to respect each other, to not make enemies of each other, not to demonize each other. All right. And then there must be a system of negotiations, of arbitration, not through force, but through discussion. And the best example of this common value actually is ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Countries. In ASEAN, we have very different cultures, very different standards of living, but we have what is known as mashwara. Mashwara is the Arab or Malay word for consensus. We tolerate each other's differences. We recognize we are different, but we live with each other. And if we disagree, let's talk about it. Let's not start fighting about it. Okay? And I think, there's ultimately, it really boils down to what is the governance in the emerging new world order that fosters plurality. And the answer to that is everybody, small or different, must have their voice. You cannot say there's only one power that decides everything, one size fits all, that what they say is absolutely right. And if we disagree, we are going to sanction you. The point is that we have to live with each other. Plurality, therefore, means seeking the common values. It is not completely scientific because moral values are emotional. And when they are emotional, we therefore have to have toleration, have to have, friendship, have to recognize that even though we disagree, we agree to disagree and then live with each other. So let me stop here and, let the others, have their different perspectives. Thank you very much indeed.
Professor Sheng, thank you so much. So eloquently said, and this is the kind of panels that I always wanted to kind of listen to, and you opened it up so well, particularly the idea of recognizing each other, and I'd like to explore that a bit more with you, and also this whole issue of how can we have governance systems that foster plurality. Thank you so much. We'll come back to you. Now over to Dr. Eric Lee. Eric, over to you.
Thank you, Chandran, for having me here today. So those of us who have been involved in the debate about East and West have been arguing endlessly about universal values, right, for decades. Frankly, I am tired of that debate. Nobody can persuade the other side. So it's really refreshing to hear and discuss a new term today, common values, as you have proposed. Now, what's the difference, right? Are we just being fashionable? So I looked them up, and it turns out from the definitions and roots of the words, they are different. The word universal comes from the Greek word oinos and the Latin word unus. It means one, okay? Mm-hmm. So universal means all in one. It's a concept of singularity, and it's by definition exclusionary. because there's only one, and that one pertains to all, and there's nothing beyond the all. On the other hand, the word common comes from the Latin communis, which means shared by all, like community, right? Shared by all. It is about what we have in common, but it is not singular. There can be things that we do not share, things that differentiate us. So by definition, it seems to be much more inclusive as a concept. We have common values, but we also accept and accommodate differences. Since the end of the Cold War, we've been dominated by the concept of universal values. Its advocates believe that when it comes to politics, economics, society, or even morality, there's only one set of values to adhere to, namely liberal values. Okay, we all know what they are. I would argue that this idea that there's only one way to do things, or even to think things, is the cause of many failures in our world today. Take politics, for example. I think it is clear that in today's world, we all want to be democratic. Democracy is a common value, if you would. Yet, there have been strong forces that have been pushing the world to accepting and implementing only one kind of democracy, liberal democracy, democracy based on liberal values. If you look at all these organizations that measure and rank countries to show how democratic they are, like the Freedom House, for instance, they rank everybody. They measure liberal procedures. Your people can be starving and miserable and have very low trust in political institutions, but if you follow liberal procedures, you're ranked higher. This is ridiculous, really. This has resulted in many developing countries, in particular, establishing political institutions that are ill-suited for their democratic development. Furthermore, the arrogance of those who advocate universal values have been ruining liberal democracy itself on their home turfs. Let me use this opportunity to put out one idea for discussion. Maybe we can move beyond this universal idea about how to realize democratic politics and think about it based on common values instead. Perhaps we can begin to measure democracy based on outcome, not on procedure. Are your people generally satisfied? Do they trust their political institutions? Are their lives getting better? Do they feel secure? Democratic outcomes are what we can all share in common. What kind of procedures and institutions we use to achieve democratic governance can and should differ based on different cultures and circumstances and values. So my final commercial for common values is this. It is by definition more interesting because it accommodates differences. Who would want a world in which there is only one way? Universal values is boring. It's time to move on. Thank you.
Eric, I wouldn't expect anything less than that from you. And precise, to the point, and as you said, even well researched. Particularly the dissection of the word universal, meaning all in one, and that there's nothing beyond that. And also then getting down to this whole issue of governance, and that we can actually need to recognize what are the democratic outcomes that we seek, and therefore what sort of outcomes do we want, and not get bogged down by processes and ideology. This is so good. So Eric, thank you so much. Hang on, we'll want to have this discussion going pretty soon. Before I bring on Professor Kurokawa Sensei, I would like to now invite our third speaker, and that is Professor Tan. Professor Tan is Professor of Philosophy at Singapore Management University and extremely well versed with some of the intellectual thought that is going on in academic circles around these issues of universal and common values. Professor Tan, over to you.
Thank you, Chairman. Greetings from Singapore. And I'm afraid I'm one of those people who have spent too much of my life in East-West arguments over the differences and similarities between Western values and Eastern values, in particular Confucian values. Well, many conflicts around the world are due to greed for material goods and power, as far as I'm concerned. But some are also due to differences in ideologies and values. When people and states try to impose on others what they claim to be universal values, which are actually ethnocentric values. So values that govern people's daily lives, their social and political arrangements are cultural, right? These are unlikely to be common on a global scale. People in different societies simply have different ways of life. This is just a fact that we have to accept. So belonging to the same natural species means that we share certain needs and vulnerabilities as human beings. However, these natural commonalities are overshadowed by the different historical experience and varied development of civilizations, so much so that being human is arguably more cultural than natural. So claims of universality for values are often rejected as ethnocentric, and I think quite justly so. So the problem of ethnocentrism does not go away, even when the quest for common values, if we think common values are universal values, is accompanied by attention to inclusiveness. So a case in point, as Professor Bell's keynote address bring out so clearly, is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The document was drafted by representatives from diverse regions of the world and ratified by the majority of UN members, including China. But it has not prevented ongoing debates about its claim to universality and accusations of its being used as a weapon in international relations for reasons that has nothing to do with protecting ordinary people from harm, right? And I think trying to make it more inclusive is not going to solve the problem. So in my view of comparative philosophy, it is not uncommon to find arguments that there are resemblances among values from different cultures, East or West, be it the value of family and community ties, compassion, or freedom, just to name just a few. However, underlying such similarities are differences that often are more important in understanding each culture and each society's interpretations, and the rankings of various values found across different societies are often significantly different. So philosophical attempts to reach consensus on common values are also plagued by the problems highlighted in Professor Bell's keynote address. So rather than finding common values, I think a better response to the current geopolitical crisis is to construct common ground on which cooperation could take place, or at least to enable peaceful coexistence. But this common ground cannot be made up of common values. What it needs is actually changes in people's attitudes and their modes of relating to others, whether it's other individuals or other states, right? With very different political ideologies, with very different cultures, right? What we need is a move towards mutual respect, a willingness to listen to others and appreciate others' perspectives, as well as to learn from them, right? So this learning must be mutual. And I'm afraid the problem of arrogance and refusal to listen to others, it applies to both sides, especially in the political sphere. Politicians all over the place, including on the international stage, quite often talk with a kind of arrogance that is just quite unbelievable, right? And previous speakers have all been quite critical of Western societies. And I have to say that I agree that the countries that call themselves liberal democracies and hold themselves up as model for the rest of the world are not very exemplary, right? So I don't agree with their criticisms of the West, but I would like to balance that a bit and say that the refusal to learn sometimes also apply to Chinese politicians. If you think about the kind of, you think about how they reject Western values, right? So it's true that elevating the people from poverty, ensuring more economic growth so that the wealth could be shared among more people is very important for developing countries. But I have never been convinced by that kind of argument when it is intended to or seem to implicitly offer as an excuse for suppression of political dissent. I just don't see why censorship, preventing your people from having their say against your policies, for example, or trying to hold politicians accountable. I don't see why that should be against a country's economic growth. So I think I'll just stop there.
Terrific, Professor Tan.
Right.
That's a great way to also end and bring some of the introspection also back towards the region, and I would like to pick that up in the discussion. Also, your point that perhaps we should be seeking common ground, and I'd like everyone to start thinking what would be the common ground for 21st century collaboration. Andrew talked about the existential issues, etc., and rather than just talk about common values. So with that, it's a good time now to pivot and invite my good friend, Professor Kurokawa Sensei, to share his view, which is both global, but also bring a Japanese perspective to this. Professor, over to you.
Thank you. I think we agree in this global world. I think also connected world. So I think many information coming through whatever you want to do. So that is a quite deceptive sometimes. But I think human activity always require in the top of organization, university or college or whatever have you, or top will be triangle with the president or CEO, this. And in the country, this is the president or whatever. And how to get rid of this person? That is the issue. So that is the wisdom. You can do only 2 terms, let's say 4 years and 2 terms. So this is the wisdom of democracy. But when you become at the top, there's a lot of sort of things you like to continue. But how to prevent it? And that is a key, how to get rid of this kind of thing. Even once you're top, I think you are somebody may inspire, just make you are doing pretty good. Nobody criticize that kind of thing. Look at once and they like to have your term one more time. So there's all the time this kind of seductive whispering people around this. That's what's happening in even United States. President is 2 terms maximum. But I think once you're in turn in this power, and there's always there's kind of somebody, and that how to get rid of this kind of thing is a very important issue. You're going to see this in completely democratic, mature country. It's very difficult to extend your term, but in growing economy and this and that, there's a lot of people around you. Suggesting you're doing so good, we like to this, and that is a completely different thing. So this I don't know how to say it. This has to be really watched by not only in the country, but internet and those things is a good thing, because eventually if you do 3 times and 4 times, I'm sure something happened this mind of this leader. And I think in corporation, you are stakeholders and shareholder, all the same. There's a much better functioning system, but in the top of each country, it's very difficult to prevent this kind of thing. I mean, you begin to see that already. Somebody want to extend their term and this and that. And how to prevent it is the key, because eventually, I think that is a human nature. How to do that in global world, right?
Thank you, Professor Kurokawa. So I think your message is using the country or a company as an example.
Right.
People have power.
Yeah.
They don't want to give it up.
Right.
And therefore, in the global order, drawing on what Professor Bell said earlier, once the rules were set at a time where a certain group of nations were essentially in control of setting those rules, it's very difficult for them to want to now change those rules. And having set them, they don't want to give it up. They don't want the plurality and the diversity of opinion.
Right.
So with that, let me just open up for a discussion. We're getting some questions, and I invite more people to ask questions. But let me just open up the discussion for 15-20 minutes, and then I'll pose some of the questions that's coming from the audience as well. The first one is I like to start with, and this is for Professor Sheng and Eric as well. Andrew, I'll call you Andrew, since if that's all right, Andrew.
Please.
Right.
So Andrew, you said that, the real challenge is 8 billion people. How do we live together? Because the majority still don't have their basic needs met in all of that. You know that probably better than I do, coming from your international experience in the World Bank. And how do we create a more stable cooperative world in that those needs are met while all these existential threats converge? Eric at the same time then said, but we need governance systems that essentially, and call it what you might, but essentially democratic in whichever way you define it, that are measured by the outcomes and the success. And that's what you both mentioned. But then Professor Tan also threw in something to say, because some systems, I think, Professor, you referred to the Chinese system, does say that to get to that point, we need certain controls put in place. So I want to open up that conversation with Andrew and Eric, maybe Andrew starting with you, Eric, then you responding, bearing in mind Professor Tan's remarks, and then Professor Tan, perhaps you can react to that, and so can Professor Kurokawa Sensei.
All right.
I hope that
Thank
makes
you.
sense. So over to you, Andrew, and then over to you, Eric.
Thank you very much. I think the discussion is very rich.
Yes.
What it goes to show that there's a difference between theory and practice,
Right.
ideology and outcomes.
Right.
So the present system, both East and West, has generally talked about top-down rather than bottom-up. And the question is, talk or you walk? When there's only talk about aspirations, idealism, etc., but you don't deliver, you talk about freedom, you talk about equality, but actually inequality is increasing. Freedom is increasingly being restricted. Instead of saying, let's negotiate, I'm going to punish you. And if you don't want, I can even escalate the punishment. Now, does that work? It doesn't work. Human societies have always lived with each other. What is the fundamental problem here? Here is that if you only believe in me, I am number one, and therefore you must do whatever I say, but do not practice what I practice, then you're in deep trouble. The bottom 99% is say, I don't disagree, I don't agree with you, right? So when you talk but do not walk, the 99% balks. They just say, I just said that, I disagree with you. And you can do whatever you want, the situation will not change. We are living in complex systems. This is not a simple solution. You give power to one order or one person, you solve the problem. The problem has to be solved by all of us. So the real reality of 8 billion people is not me, it's we. How do we change together? Not about aspirations, but actually in terms of delivery, what Eric calls outcomes. Okay? Now, the very fact that we cannot agree, we have to listen, we have to negotiate, we have to be more patient. We cannot say, if you don't like this, I'm going to punish you, right? We have to persuade. And I think this is I don't like to say this is East, this is West, or whatever. It is about humanity. Humanity is not one. We are one people, but we are divided into many different races, many different religions, many different cultures. And the very fact that we have difference means that toleration and understanding of each other, respect for each other is extremely important. Now, if that moral value is not there, and then you say, okay, we will escalate this like alphas in a burning forest. This is not a solution. And that is why the bulk of the people in the world, I'm not saying that there is a group of very rich people who feel that they are entitled to the domination of the system. The rest just want to have a conversation. How is that conversation going to be constructed is the process that has not been agreed on. The status quo powers, the unipolar issues, they say, I have already established the process. If you disagree, you lump it. And the others are saying, no, I disagree. I want to have a conversation on this. But you can't have a conversation. And that's why we're in this very difficult transition period. Just let me stop there.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Andrew. Eric, can I bring you in to sort of amplify that issue about governance systems, democratic outcomes, and then perhaps you could respond to Professor Tan's question about that sort of apparent contradiction about rejecting, as seen in certain parts of the world, that China's desired intentions in its development process to sort of curb certain individualism activities. Some call it censorship, etc. Over to you, Eric.
Well, I'm not sure how the theories work in terms of censorship or free speech and letting political dissent survive or flourish or whatever, what have you. But what we're observing from China, looking at the world, is it simply doesn't work. If you're looking around the world, our problem, the biggest problems are not caused by probably suppression of speech. The biggest problems in today's world are caused by unrestrained free speech. If you look at the internet today, rampant with fake news and hate that tear apart societies, okay? And unrestrained free speech is easily captured by special interests to direct government to serve their own interests at the expense of the collective, okay? Unrestrained free speech is easily abused by demagoguery everywhere in the world. We see it every day on TV, okay? So we're certainly not gonna follow that path. It doesn't work, and it causes tremendous harm and human suffering in poor countries and rich countries alike. I would argue that unrestrained free speech is making poor countries unable to become richer and making rich countries become poorer. So our goal should be to figure out a way that works for your country and my country and different countries. I think should have different formulas to devise systems where we can get information and constructive views from the bottom up, and then from the top down make the correct decisions to make our government functional and serve the people's interests. Instead, so that's the formula we need to work on and fine tune. So that's all.
Eric, thank you. That is a very robust way of also looking at it, and that is a widely known thing. Professor Tan, I think it would be interesting to see, given that you're in Singapore, where some would argue that there is censorship and there is sort of political constraints as well. How do you think? And I'm particularly, I don't want us to continue on that discussion, but I'm really interested also in your point of view that universal values are essentially masquerading to hide ethnocentric values. And what are those ethnocentric values that you think, particularly maybe for the audience to understand, are getting in the way of international collaboration and the type of peace and international cooperation that Andrew was talking about?
Yeah. Well, I think there's a big difference between totally unconstrained speech and censorship that are used to suppress political dissent. Right? Yeah. My concern is the kind of censorship that's actually being used by government to suppress dissent. Right. This actually, the point that Eric has brought up actually ties in very nicely with one of the questions in the chat that talks about the role of media in finding common values, right? Yeah. Unfortunately, the way the media has been abused over the past decade or so is actually adding to the problem because of all this fake news and misinformation, as well as, special interests capturing some of these domain and stirring up trouble, basically, right? But I think the better response to that kind of problem is really to find a way, and this is where I think I actually agree that we actually don't disagree, Eric and I, on this, is that you need to find a way of putting it to the audience of these media, right? Which are the misinformation, the fake news. It means to try to correct them in a way that is public and open and transparent, right? And this should not be left to government to do, because while it's good if one can have a government that one could trust, But I also believe that one should not be too trusting of all governments. So the people themselves must play a part, especially the people who have more education, who have exposure to different kinds of societies and cultures, who have traveled the world. You know, if they know something, they have knowledge, they have expertise, then that should be shared with more people. And they should step forward to try to correct misinformation whenever they see it happening around them, right? Whether it's in daily conversation or in the social media, right? So that's a better way to deal with the kind of problem, because I really don't think, even with Singapore, right? So we have come up with our own way of dealing with that. We have a law, right? That's called POFMA. I can't remember what POFMA stands for, but basically, rather than just censorship by the government, what the government has done is that the government has in a way, what they call a right to respond, right? So they could say, okay, this is actually making a false accusation against my ministry. And unless they can provide the proof, we want them to put forward a correction of their views. Otherwise, then we will shut it down, right? So at least there is still censorship, because the government has the power to shut down these platforms that, you know, in their, according to them, are spreading misinformation. But at least they must present to the people, and it's left to the people to decide whether the reasons that the government has put forward for shutting down these platforms are justified or not, right? So both parties has got to come up with their justification for their actions in this, in a way, a contest, right? So that's one example. So if we talk about universal and ethnocentric value, right? So many people, certainly Westerners, will say freedom is a universal value. And at one level, I can actually agree, but only a very thin version of freedom, okay? Because even within Confucianism itself, one could argue that value is freedom is a value within Confucianism. What kind of freedom? Moral freedom. Because in the teachings of Confucius, you will find that it's very clear that he believes that in order to become virtuous, it must be a voluntary effort. You cannot force people to become virtuous, right? You can make them go through the motions, follow your rules, do all the rituals. But if it doesn't come voluntarily, right? If the right feelings are not there, then it's not true virtue. Okay, so true virtue requires moral freedom, right? But this moral freedom is not the same as the kind of freedom that many liberal democracies is always waving in front of everybody, right? So just to take a very recent example, right? This whole thing about mask wearing during COVID, right? Yeah. We know that in the States, the extent to which some people refuse to wear masks, just to many of us, certainly, I think, not just in Singapore, not just to Singaporeans, but other Asian societies probably find it incredible that people should, you know, how much of an imposition is it on you to require you to wear masks, when the justification for that is that not only for your own protection, but it's supposed to protect the people around you, your loved ones, but also to even your fellow citizens, right? So, okay, maybe this information may or may not be correct, but if there is a chance of simply protecting these people, is it really too much to ask you to wear a mask? How is that such an infringement on your freedom that you have to, you know, have protests, and including even, you know, persecuting other people who voluntarily wear masks, right? So this is where the balance between what is considered individual freedom and social responsibility. I think Asians, not just Confucians, most Asians, I think the balance between individual freedom and social responsibility is quite different from how the West weigh these two things. So this is where, you know, on the one hand, if you think of freedom as only the thin version, the moral freedom, then it seems like a universal value. But in actual fact, most of the time within liberal democracy, the kind of value of freedom that they are proposing is actually an ethnocentric one that is very heavily emphasized on individual freedom at the expense of social responsibility.
Thank you, Professor Tan. And so before I invite Professor Bell to just say a few words, I'm going to ask Professor Kurokawa Sensei to take that forward, because one of the sort of common values, you could say, the differences is that in I'm not just saying in Asia, but also in Africa, Ubuntu culture, etc. And Japan, I think, exemplifies it, but Professor, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, that the individual is subservient to the interests of the collective. And so when you were talking about moral freedom, Professor was going, yes. So Professor Kurokawa Sensei, can you comment on this point, and bearing in mind the purpose of this discussion, which is plurality in the sort of new world order, where other powers have now want to decide what the rules are, and not willing to be punished because they have their own systems, and which is the source of much tension in the world. Professor Kurokawa Sensei, the individual versus the collective, how systems differ, and is the Japanese system where the collective, is essentially one the individual respects. I think the Chinese system has that. Is that something that should be admired and respected more in this new world order? Muted. Sorry, Professor, you were muted. We are unmuting you.
I'm all right. All right.
Okay, good.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I have been thinking recently, and I just making this kind of statement. When you become a prime minister of Japan, this is the top, right? And he could continue at least maybe twice or whatever. But I think two person who invited number 2 person. This is a very important person because I think that's executed was, in my view, Nakasone-san and Prime Minister Koizumi. Because I'm telling this bureaucrats too, who is the number 2 person who will never seek your post? Very clear, right? So that he can advise anything and many good things because they want to support him and not really dropping this guy. And this is Nakasone-san, number 2 one was number 2 one was ex governor of Tokyo. So he will never seek his post, but he's a very clever man. So I think he just support this prime minister all the time, gathering all the information, share this thing and make a good thing to him and do this, do that. So that's Nakasone-san was intuitively right. Another one was Koizumi-san. His number 2 was a head of finance minister, but he is a very senior, very well reserved. So he's sure not going to. So he supports Koizumi-san, and all the information he just seek good one into him and broke certain thing to protect him. So this is a wisdom of a person in the top of any institution or country and this and that. That is the wisdom of selecting number 2 person is a key. He's a CEO or president or whatever. And that's my view.
Thank you, Professor Kurokawa Sensei. And Professor Bell, so you've listened to everybody. Could I invite you to just comment on a couple of things in the context of what you said around, the search for common values, the barriers, the problems we have, and the way forward. And then I'm going to open it up. We have a flurry of questions here. So your thoughts on what you've heard so far. And I'd like to bring us back to the theme. It's finding common values, because I would like to end this, and we have another half an hour, with each of you saying,
great,
this is a common value that we could all pursue. And if I was in charge of the UN, this is what I would try to do to foster over the next 20 years a framework.
Right.
So at the end of this, we'd like every one of you to say that. Over to you, Professor Bell.
Thank you. I mean, very briefly, let me just say a little bit about the freedom of speech, whether it's a common value or whether it's an area where we should respect plurality. I mean, clearly it's going to be hard to achieve if we have some sort of unforced dialogue between different countries and religions and ethical systems. It's going to be hard to agree on where exactly to draw the line. I mean, there are legitimate cultural variations. Obviously in the US, it's in their constitution, their history and so on. They're going to strongly value the freedom of speech, but in other societies, perhaps more in this part of the world, my mind is in Asia, there might be more emphasis on social harmony. So for example, on pornography, I don't think that it's ever going to be kind of free-flowing in China in a way that it is in the US, for example. But to go back a bit to Professor Tan's piece. And here I agree that there's also a difference between the kind of, free-flowing stuff on the internet full of false views and so on, and the informed views of, well, let's just use elitist language, intellectuals, who might have more experience and might have genuine concerns about their way the society is operating. I think that there's much more of a case for more freedom of speech in that area. And in the case of scientists with conscience, for example, it's quite clear that in the early days of the COVID, if there had been more freedom of speech for scientists with a conscience, perhaps we could have avoided some difficulties. But that said, it also depends on level of economic development. I mean, when I was first in Singapore, it was in the early 90s, it was very, very tight constraints on the freedom of speech, not just in politics, but in academia. And since then, it's been a dramatic, maybe dramatic opening up. And I think it's related partly to the level of economic development and the fact that you have so many educated people who want to have more say in government. And it's still not a kind of free-flowing discussion in a way that might be the case in the US or Canada, but it's huge. I'm going to use the word progress here compared to what it was in the early 90s. And it does depend partly on level of economic development too.
Thank you very much. And I'd just like to remind everyone who has been, when we talk about freedom of speech, everyone will know the timing of the case against Julian Assange. So suppression of freedom of speech and exposure of facts, etc., is not something that's only practiced by so-called, countries in Asia or Africa. At the moment, Julian Assange is the victim of essentially censorship, imprisonment, etc., by the UK, Britain, and its European allies too, because he broke the rules by disclosing information that the governments didn't want to know. But let's move tack slightly, and I would like to ask, there's a question now, and Eric, since you're so involved sometimes in talking about this at a political level and about the economies, the question is, with the world so politically and economically polarized, and we want to look forward, we want to be optimistic, what does the new world order look like? Is there a glimmer of hope for a more universal cooperation on common values? And that's really where I want to drive the conversation for the next half an hour. Is there more hope? What are the themes that we can agree on? What can we end this conversation with that says these are the areas we could focus on? Eric, over to you. What's your view in response to that question?
Well, I mean, it doesn't look so good at the moment.
Right.
There
must be hope. We can't be staying in this situation for a long time, because that's very, very hopeless almost.
Well, I mean, I'm sorry to be kind of pessimistic. If you look at the two largest problems that we faced, both in the short term and long term, that we will have really common, not just values, just common interests for survival, the pandemic and climate change.
Yeah.
And we're being torn apart. Everybody's using politics, using geopolitics to divide us. So I think it's very difficult. And I think, but obviously in long term, we have no choice if we are to survive on this planet, that we must figure out a way to overcome these difficulties and work together. And I think this, discussions like this, we need to have more. I believe that if we do not say goodbye to universal values, if we do not say goodbye to unipolarity, we will sink deeper and deeper until there's no way back. And so it is critical for us, both conceptually and practically, to overcome this idea that somehow there's only one way, somehow one culture, one ism controls the truth.
This is really important. This is why we were having this conversation. And I hope we're having this conversation in a way that the audience understands, is to kind of bring in different views and to address what you said. We have to overcome that there's only one way. and it has to be multipolar, and it has to be respectful. Andrew, how would you respond to that? Because you did start off the conversation by saying multipolar was the norm before, and then suddenly we had this unipolar system. To Eric's view, point, how do we, how does the world come together, particularly those who, as you pointed out, didn't buy into this unipolar view? How do we help those who are adherents to that one system to break away from that trap? And you,
well, I think
multilateral system, you may give us some hints.
The point that I really want to make is some deep down, as you know, there are a lot of writings on what really constitutes the West. And the West is very dominated by Christianity. And within that Christianity streak, and I say there's a continuum, there is absolutism. You know, good is good and evil must be defeated, must be contained. But the minute we start down that path and do not recognize that the good and evil are part one, they are entangled. There is no such thing as absolute good, and there's no such thing as absolute bad, because you know the too much good is very bad side effects, and too much evil, and then you know there are some hopes of good, right? So life is changing all the time, and an interaction. So the idea that we must weaponize everything, we must demonize everything, makes us go into a situation where that there is no more hope. You know, hope always, human beings have always evolved because ultimately we find solutions through negotiations. You know, sometimes we have to fight for this. But now the challenges of our times, climate change, pandemic, nuclear war, this has to be done through negotiation, through compromise, not to say, I am absolutely right and you are absolutely wrong. Now, it's that, you know, it's that Zugwang situation, to use a chess term, you know, that nobody is willing to compromise, and that escalation can lead to the demise of humanity. Not just humanity, but demise of the earth itself is a greater sort of situation that is truly existential. So I don't think it is about the existentialism of the unipolar power or the existentialism of the rivals. The real issue is, what is it that we will have to do to inculcate not just common values, but common grounds to have a negotiation discussion. Without that, I think, you know, I share with everybody, you know, there is no exit ramp. And when we are on one earth, who do we exit to? Mars?
So we have, I mean, what I'm hearing is we have the need for new mediators almost, because there's two entrenched positions almost. You said everyone, but I think what you mean is, you know, in the current predicament we have, the West led by the United States, and then there's China, and all the rest of us are sort of caught in between. And I'm wondering whether, you know, ASEAN could be mediators in saying, hey, how do we bring this? And this little conversation here is to hopefully, as Eric said, spark faith that only if we talk openly, only if we do these things, perhaps we can bring things, you know, to a bit of a conclusion, and not allow the current sort of paralysis, which does not include the whole world. I mean, we're all paralyzed, but the forces are actually not the entire world. So to that, I would like to ask Professor Tan. There's a question actually from Uganda, responding to Professor Bell's point about the respect of each other. And this is a question from Africa. And I think that comes from a deep place. And I've heard this many times. My question, she says, is any ideas on how this can be done? I think it's a very profound, but, you know, it's an important question. How do we create this point, to Andrew said, you know, how do we create these platforms without respect? And where do we start? And do mediators allow? Because I noticed this week, as you all probably did, that the mayor of the UAE went to meet Putin to try and see if they could be negotiators. So Andrew, to your point, small states with a bit of leverage may be the access route to creating this new world of thinking, because maybe we have insights that can enlighten those who are so entrenched? Over to you, Professor Tan.
Right. I think Professor Sheng already made a very good start, right? I mean, to find common ground, you have to stop seeing the world in black and white, okay, for us or against us, and nothing in between.
Yeah.
Okay, when actually it's all shades of gray. And what's really important is that how do you bridge two apparently opposing position, people with opposite interests? It's just possible if people are willing to compromise, right? But to compromise, I think first of all, there has to be a willingness to see the other's perspective, understand their constraints and their priorities, right? And of course, it doesn't mean, I mean, one must also not be so, it will be totally too idealistic to think that people should be altruistic when it comes to negotiation. No, I think everybody should take care of their own interests. But that doesn't mean that you have to totally demolish the other side. That is where it's just, you just make negotiation impossible, right? You demonize the other side. You treat the other side as basically scoundrels, okay, who break the rules all the time, who are only out to take advantage of you. If you start out with that kind of assumptions about your opponents, then you are basically making any kind of negotiation, conversation impossible. Right? And unfortunately, I think the geopolitical situation between the major powers is heading in that direction. Okay, I will not try to apportion blame. I think we all have our own assessment of who is more to blame, or probably both sides equally to blame. And unfortunately, for small states like Malaysia, Singapore, the ASEAN members, we are very worried because we are likely to be caught in between. So constantly, certainly in Singapore, we keep hearing our politicians saying, we don't want to choose sides, we don't want to choose sides. We want to try to provide a way to bridge, to help the major powers come to some kind of understanding and some kind of modes of coexistence. Right, so this is very, very important to the rest of us who are not caught up in this ridiculous. To me, it's like this kind of macho show of only one of us can win. I must knock down my opponent for good. Right, it's just totally ridiculous. Right, you cannot talk about sharing a common world if you have this kind of attitude. That means you are not committed to share survival. You don't see survival as something that has to be either we all survive or we are all going down, right? Until we have some other way out of this planet. If we only have this planet, it's either we all survive or we all go down.
So, right? So Professor Tan, I think you mentioned
to these major powers.
Yeah. So I'm wondering, and I'm going to ask Professor Kurokawa Sensei to try and respond to that, because it's also a question that's been asked. Is it a possibility that small powers who have great wisdom too, but because they are small, are ignored, but are great at thinking? I mean, Singapore has a few world-class diplomats. I can think of at least two, Giorgio, etc. Shouldn't some of the ASEAN has a couple the Middle East, Africa, great diplomats. Is it time, and Professor Kurokawa-san said, maybe you can respond, that a small group, Andrew, I know you have to leave. We really appreciate you having been with us. And I will make sure that you receive the recordings, etc. Thank you so much for your attendance. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. I apologize. Bye-bye.
Not at all. So Kurokawa Sensei, is it time that perhaps some of the smaller nations put together a cohort of some of the best diplomats in the in the region? Because far too often diplomacy, whether it's a conflict in Africa or whether it's in Myanmar, has to be led by some European or American delegation. It's an old world. I've often wondered, could that be some Asians, Japanese, Africans mediating to build what Professor Tan said first, the common ground, what Eric talked about. Let's start talking about universal values. Let's talk about some common values, and let's go forward. What do you think? Could this be the moment where we create a new sort of diplomacy, small states, cultures, and wisdoms intervening?
Yeah, I really think so. Education is one of the key. So that when I was a science advisor to the Prime Minister Abe, maybe 20 years ago, which continued to 2 years, but I think he resigned after 1 year. But I created a system inviting two youngsters, 15, like mid-teens from 13 Asian countries, and invite them to Okinawa, spend together for 4 weeks, and they do many studies and playing all the things. When I always give an opening or a last, almost commencement thing, give them a speech, and they are so happy of this 4 weeks together in mid-teens, and they continue to connect and building a new business elsewhere. And in Indonesia guy just hired a few Japanese retired person to help him with the business. So I think mid-teens is a good time, not much sort of swayed into one culture or this or that, but together, spending together in 4 weeks, they completely become different, and they really like each other. They are the connecting dots for whatever career they may take. So that kind of thing will be very important. Once you get into university, that may be already come sort of one of certain impact, so that mid-teens spend 4 weeks together. That kind of more promoting this kind of thing is very useful to nurture future leaders in any countries. In my view, I think otherwise you have something already with a stake, not to say or this or that. So I think I really like to have that kind of program, because after 10 years, somehow Japanese government terminated this thing.
Yeah, in fact, that sort of people-to-people sort of introduction from a young age is going to be diploma. Is going to be the subject of the next panel.
Right.
Professor
Okay.
Bell, would you care to comment on this point about if we are to build a common ground first, around which then we can start building some common values, which is not dominated as it is today through the institutions of the West. And I'm not trying to say, all the problems lie with it, but we can't run away from the dominance of, as you pointed out, the Western institutions and the adherence to declarations that do not belong to today's world, as you pointed out. Do you think there's a point here now that smaller nations, which have very good diplomats, etc., could form some sort of a basis by which they mediate and advise, rather than going individually like the UAE has gone and try to broker some sort of peace?
I guess you're asking me? Or?
Yes, Professor.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. I mean, there's this idea of the Keystone State, which I think is a good one, and these are smaller states that have global influence, partly, or let's say regional influence, because they're viewed as more neutral, and they have very high quality diplomats. They have a kind of strong system of political meritocracy that allows them to select very capable and experienced public officials and diplomats. I mean, if there was an organization of these keystone states that would discuss issues that are more existential, like climate change or pandemics, I think it would be an important step forward, and they would be viewed as less partisan than if they're from large, powerful states.
All right. I mean, we don't have anyone from the United States on this panel. The next one we will have, I think, representation. But can I ask Eric? Eric, if there was to be this idea, because we have 10 minutes left, how do you think the Chinese reaction would be to sort of, mediators that come from not just the West, but from different parts of the world, with great wisdom, different civilizational backgrounds, trying to do something that would help the current tensions? And let's not run away from it, between the West and China's rise.
I think that China is extremely interested in developing networks and relationships with the global South. Okay, this is what I read and hear every day here on the ground. And obviously, the global South includes countries that are not only small but poor as well.
Yeah.
Okay. But I think that's a major Chinese priority now. It wasn't a priority for some time because we were busy developing ourselves. But now it's a major priority for the Chinese government and society and many institutions to pursue relationships and dialogue with the global South. And I think that's probably one of the more positive trends that I have observed in the Chinese approach.
That the focus on the
outreach toward the global South, not just on economics, not just this is not just the Belt and Road Initiative, but initiatives to discuss things about politics, about philosophy, about culture, about development models, and that is an outreach that was long overdue, and I think the Chinese are pursuing with a lot of energy.
And it's an area that that we have also been looking at, and the ability for other countries not to adopt, as we've already agreed, the Chinese political system or whatever, but to learn from the Chinese experience of development, which, irrespective of the ideological bias, you can agree China's done a phenomenal work.
And I think it's highly relevant. The global South, many of them bought the prospectus of the Universalists.
Yes.
After the Cold War, okay, and just like buying a prospectus from a bad IPO, it didn't pan out. They're on the losing end. They haven't developed successfully. Many of them are suffering, not only from a lack of development, but civil strife. Many social and economic problems and political problems. So they are. The global South countries are very open-minded at this moment because what they've experienced in the last, decades of this universal epoch, if you will. And look at Pakistan. So many people are underwater now. The vast lands in Pakistan is underwater. It's an absolute tragedy. Yet, how much carbon dioxide is Pakistan responsible for emitting? Tiny little fraction, right? So all this injustice that's happened to the global South, I think that makes them fertile ground for philosophical innovations and philosophical open-mindedness.
And that's where you think we can find some common ground in terms of learning from each other.
Yes.
And nations like China. And
exactly. I think they will be open-minded to discussing and developing common values. And so I think I find that trend encouraging.
Just to follow that up for one second, the Confucius Institutes, they may not be welcome in Western countries, but they're often hugely welcome outside. And just to give you an example of the sorts of dialogues, there was one sponsoring a dialogue between Confucians and Ubuntu, defenders of Ubuntu in South Africa, and it was hugely productive. And realized that there's much consensus upon this value of social harmony, which is devalued in Western countries. Those sorts of dialogue are hugely important.
Yeah.
Go ahead, please.
So I think I think we have good opportunities before us. I was being pessimistic before, but we certainly have good opportunities before us. We have China that has grown so much. China is a major power in the world, largest economy in the world by some measures. And we have many smaller countries that are both rich, like Singapore and UAE, and also less developed, like the countries in the global South, that are open-minded for developing common values. And shall I say, another piece of good news is the Universalists are in disarray, in complete disarray. So they're busy fighting civil wars amongst themselves. I'm talking about philosophical civil wars. Look at the United States of America, with probably the largest universalist country on earth. They can't even agree on whether a woman should have the freedom to control her body and not to give birth, or whether an unborn should have the freedom to be born. So they are in fundamental disarray. So let them busy themselves with that. I would say that let us pursue discussions about common values. And let me we have a couple more minutes. Let me make a proposal here.
Yes, please. I'm going to end this by saying one proposal from each of you.
Okay,
would
so
be a
I'll
good
start.
way. And
I'll start.
I'm glad to see you on an optimistic note now, Eric. Thank you.
I want Daniel Bell to start writing about this. So labeling is very important, right? So on the other side, we have the universalists. That's their label, and they've accepted that label. That's the, they acknowledge that. That's where they stand. They stand for universalism. We should label ourselves commoners. So commoners versus universalists.
And the commoners are those who are looking for common values, common ground in which to share, and particularly to look at equity. And I do agree that I was in Europe recently 2 weeks ago, and I was a bit dismayed by how pessimistic everyone was about the world. And I said to them that in most parts of Asia, people are worried, but they're not pessimistic because they're coming from a lower base. And what they're looking for is for greater harmony in the geopolitics so that they can get on with the great task of improving their lives. I come from Southeast Asia. Professor Tan, you come from Southeast Asia too. Eric, you come from China, etc. There's so much optimism, but it's now standing in the way. And I fear that unless the West starts to find common ground with the global majority who wants that, and Professor Bell articulated this very well, I think the rest of the world, like Eric, you said, will just move on. We will have to put up with some pain, but we will move on as we find the need, as Andrew so clearly said, the need to get on with cooperating. And as Professor Tan said, otherwise we all have a very bleak future. So I think we will move on. So Professor Tan, over to you. What is your suggestion? How do we?
I want to first disagree that that Europe and US in disarray is good news. I think that's very, very bad news.
Yeah.
That disarray, we are not going to benefit from it. We will also suffer.
Yes.
If they don't get their act together. And
Agreed.
I'm also concerned that when it comes to value, even though most of those countries don't live up to their own ideals, some of those values, regardless of their origin, they may be Western values, but that doesn't mean that we cannot learn something from them, right? Asian societies, I think we can learn something from them without giving up our own cultural uniqueness. So that's a qualifier that I want to put out there. As to what we can do, in some ways, your second panel is a good start. I don't think we should leave everything to the states and to politicians. So we need people to be more active about this. Okay, so as educators, for example, I think it's very important for students to acquire a more international outlook in the sense that they need to learn more about other countries so that they can start this process of looking at international problems from different perspectives, and also to understand the actions of people and states with different cultures, where they are coming from, why do they behave the way they behave, so that you do not always put the worst possible construction on them. Right? That just because they don't behave like you think that they must be the enemy or that there must be something wrong with them. Okay, so I think that's very important. So education, not just formal education, but simply in terms of trying to expose ordinary people to more knowledge about the rest of the world. So this is where technology gives us the means, but unfortunately, we are not using it in the best possible way. Right? We have the means now, but we are not using it to really put more information and knowledge out there that will make people more international in their outlook and increase their understanding of other countries and other peoples. So I think that's where I would start.
Thank you, Professor Tan. Very Singaporean. Let's all benefit from this. I totally agree with you, and I think Eric would agree. A declining United States and a declining Europe is in no one's interest. They need to be part and parcel of a thriving world. They have much to offer. The only point I was trying to make is that the rest of the world, with the majority, will have to move on if, as we all agree, the current tensions seem to be one in which we are stuck in old modes of thinking, and we'll have to find new approaches, and these common values may have to be built not out of the old world, but out of the new world, the emerging new world. And that's part of this discussion. Professor Kurokawa Sensei, we have 2 minutes, and then Andrew, just a final word. Your proposal for common values. You have to unmute, Professor. What's the Japanese recommendation for common values? Put the collective ahead of the individual.
Yeah, my individual college student, take a leave for 1 year, go abroad somewhere, make friends. You study or do NGO, whatever you do, just leave for 1 year and spend 4 years of tuition, take 5 years to finish your college. That's my argument, and there's something. So just us pushing government to encourage this kind of thing. Think what you can do.
So people to people, government, scholarships.
Right.
That's going to be the next session. Andrew, over to you. We got a minute. Just sorry, not Andrew. Professor Bell. Last words.
Daniel, please. Well, I like Eric's idea of some sort of commoner's manifesto. But maybe the word commoner might have to be, because it sounds like as opposed to intellectual. So maybe some sort of, with much stronger representation of the South, drafting something like a declaration of interdependence. I mean, that would be, but that emphasizes not just what are the common values, but what are the areas of morally justifiable difference. I mean, I think that might be a good start.
Mm-hmm. All right. Yeah.
Okay. I think you and Eric are going to start funding this little book. I'm happy to write the foreword for it. But with that, we should. And
all right.
With that, we should end. I hope you all enjoyed it. We got a ton of questions. The people who answered questions.